afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to discuss the situation in Europe 1 week after Germany elected a new parliament, which does not conclusively mean we have a new government at once. I think it will last until, let's say, hopefully until short before Christmas that we will have a new government. And most probably, I would suggest it might be a coalition of Social Democrats, Greens and Liberal Democrats, but this is not yet decided. We are meeting also 7 months before France is going to elect a new president, and tonight in Ljubljana will start the Western Balkans Summit of the European Union with those 6 nations who want to be member of European Union, and even Macedonia and Albania, which are not yet which already was agreed to let the negotiations start. The negotiations not really started until now, and I don't expect anything happening tonight and tomorrow at this Western Balkan Summit. And during a period where the future of Europe is discussed in the EU of 27, at least until June next year, when the French presidency of European Union will conclude, maybe it lasts a little bit longer, not only due to the pandemic, but also to the wishes of many people in Europe who say it's not enough to discuss the situation only for 1.5 years. Yesterday, many of you might have expected that the Nobel Prize in Medicine would have been awarded to a Hungarian, to Katalin Karikó, the scientist who left in 1985 Hungary to practice at the University of Princeton in the US. 2013, she came back to Europe, went to BioNTech in Mainz, where her experience in these feasibilities, which now provided us with the BioNTech vaccine, was very helpful when the SARS-CoV virus fell upon us worldwide in 2020. Maybe due to the fact that she's only 66 years young, she was not awarded the Nobel Prize, but maybe some years later she might be lucky anyway. Back to the question raised by you, which is now, from my perspective, really interesting. Europe of 2 velocities or Europe really united? When we look at the actual situation, I would say Europe is not really united. We already do have a Europe of 2 velocities. The euro is not introduced in all 27 countries. Schengen is a cooperation of not all member states, besides the fact that during pandemic times, borders were closed and still are now and then closed again. The European chief prosecutor can only deal with 21 member states. Hungary is one of those who will not yet participate in haunting corruption with EU-funded money from the outside from EU General Prosecutor. There is a framework of cooperation between EU and Hungary, but this does not include operational access to invent misuse of European money in Hungary by the General Prosecutor, assisted by possibly 2 prosecutors from Hungary, which would make the things easier. I could continue this list, but I stop at this point. And let's have a look back to the start of the development of the European Union in the last 78 years. World War II was ending when Robert Schuman, Alice de Gasperi and others planned already how to avoid a 3rd World War, or at least a 3rd big war in Europe. So they suggested to start with economic cooperation in the field of coal and steel. The European Coal and Steel Community was born and founded in Paris with the Treaty of Paris. Members from the beginning have been France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, and at this time, West Germany. In 1957, the treaty was transformed into the European Economic Community, and an equivalent for atomic energy existed. This was the beginning, with the Treaty of Rome, 1957, of the body we nowadays call the European Union. More and more European states entered the Union over time, until after the fall of the Iron Curtain, Hungary entered as well in 2004. Whereas 9 other nations also from the former Soviet bloc entered. Now, we are 17 years later in history, and where are we heading now? Let me first explain where the title from a lecture comes from. When negotiations began in the early 90s about accession of former communist countries into the European Union, 2 German politicians, Wolfgang Schäuble, now President of Parliament, at this time head of the CDU-CSU in Parliament in Bonn, as well as Karl Lamers, then spokesperson for foreign affairs of those two parties, CDU and CSU, published a paper in 1994 which is called A Europe of Two Velocities. Reason at this time was both expected great problems for the economies of the former communist nations in the accession process to the European Union and therefore thought about going forward step by step, meaning integration not at all at once, as it more or less happened in 2004, but as an accession process that would have brought you in gradually. We all know it didn't happen this way, but nevertheless the question is still valid, I think. The wish of all newly liberated nations in the East was so pressing at this time to enter as soon as possible the European Union after they had entered already NATO. Why to discuss it today? It's quite easy, I think. Still, there's a growing gap between those member states who want to integrate more their policies in the field, for example, of foreign and security policy, as well as more integration of economic and financial policies, as well as more integration of policies in social fields. The internal market will not really function on the long run if the 27 European nations united now, maybe with those 6 West Balkan nations in some years from now, won't be able to be one united Europe, speaking with one voice, showing that democracy and social welfare and economic power are able to be a role model for other parts of the world, in contradiction to the model of the People's Republic of China, autocratic ruling and economic success. But at the very moment, this is really not the case for Europe, and this is not only obvious after Great Britain left the Union, decided 2016 by a popular vote which was gained by a lot of lies through politicians like Boris Johnson's now Prime Minister. Whoever will govern Germany run the next 4 years, and most probably this will be the coalition I mentioned, Social Democrats, Green Party and Liberals, they will of course follow a path of more integration in the future. The mainstream in Germany concerning Europe is obvious. If Europe in the borders of the European Union will not be able to get its act together, then we all will lose in the next 3 decades. In concurrence to the United States and to China, we must unite in many facets and can no longer allow ourselves to rest on those merits we got in the last 3 centuries, in good and in bad. Are we able to sell the model of social welfare of the European Union, which was so successful in the last 30 to 40 years, or will we see less and less cooperation, as some heads of state and governments want to have? I do think here indeed of, for example, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, of Prime Minister Babiš from Czech Republic, of Prime Minister Janša from Slovenia, Prime Minister Kurz from Austria. The extreme right in many countries in the European Union is successful with slogans like, let's get out of EU, let's leave the euro. France first, Slovenia first, Czech first, or Austria first, and Orban plays the same tune. In Great Britain now, we can watch on a daily basis a reality show what it means to disintegrate the European economy and the European Union. No truck drivers any longer from Europe available, no gasoline at the station, and not at all the food we are accustomed to in the supermarkets. Parts of the financial industry left Great Britain, as well as specialists from different fields. The former superpower and Commonwealth of Nations, Great Britain, diminished into a small group of islands, proud but not really able to live on its own. France and Germany, first only West, have been the locomotive of Europe for a long time. After Charles de Gaulle, the French president of the end 50s and beginning 60s, rejected the accession of Great Britain first, Great Britain entered the European Union in 1973. Already then we could envisage that most British governments did not want too much integration. Therefore, it took a long time until the common market was established on January the 1st, 1993. Free flow of goods and persons was established. Frontiers did no longer play the role they had in the past. Obviously, the pandemic showed this must not last forever. Due to the fact that health policy is not a common policy in the European Union, each country took care of its own population. It was not easy to overcome the obstacles. Finally, the EU was quite successful in buying vaccines on the world market. Hungary, as well as Serbia, had more trust in its own abilities and ordered a lot of vaccines from Russia and from China. When I'm informed correct, neither the Russian vaccine nor the Chinese is accredited by the European Medicines Agency. Will we ever come back to normal, to integration, to open borders? I think many of us wish that long lines crossing the border will be forgotten as soon as possible. Although for the time being and the ever-changing developments of the COVID pandemic, we cannot be sure whether the closure of frontiers will be a reality soon. May I look back into another story of the European Union? In 1999, when I started in Brussels, there started also a process which should have led to a European constitution. For 3 years, elected members of national parliaments, of the European Parliament and of the governments of the European Union, as well as those countries who wanted to access the European Union as people who watched the process and could contribute to this process, worked on a constitution which should make possible an ever closer knit European Union. As you remember, this proposal needed to be approved in all member countries, in the European Parliament, and by all governments, in some of them by popular vote. It failed to do so in the Netherlands and in France. It took some years more and less cooperation, which finally led us to the Lisbon Treaty. And there already we find instruments improved in comparison to the Treaty of Nice from 1999, that enable kind of a coalition of the willing in different fields of policy. This opens the door to a Europe of two velocities as we have it nowadays. And we find these possibilities now put into place in different fields of policies. And if I may, I now have a look into your country. In April, there will be new elections. And if Viktor Orban will again be re-elected, he will follow his path of economic cooperation where it is useful for him, as he thinks. Knowing that 3% of the Hungarian budget is fed by money from the European Union, this transfer aims to improve the life of all people living in Hungary, to bring them into the level other parts of Europe already reached. This will take a long time, but nevertheless, this is the aim, and this is the budget the European Union every year and for 5 years establishes. It will be even more complicated when the Hungarian government is still ignoring decisions of the European Court in Luxembourg, when the government is introducing again hate speech in the election campaign we face now, as they did last time against Jean-Claude Juncker, the then president of the European Commission, and George Soros, the former Hungarian, when the rule of law is not really implemented, but just the contrary, is loosened more and more and brought under the control of the Fidesz, when the media since 2010 are not really free because oligarchs are helping Orban to bring his message into the tiniest cottage in the rural area and in the cities, when universities are transferred into foundations which no longer are obliged to make their finances transparent and their handling of science, when anti-asylum policy is packed into a so-called Christian policy and barbed wire is making it nearly impossible for people fleeing from dictatorships in foreign countries because they might be killed there or put into prison for a long time only because they have their own faith, their own political will. Let me not tackle brackets, of course. There's a misuse of Geneva Convention, of course, and we have to decide how to tackle this in the future. But still, the core of the Geneva Convention, bringing asylum rights to people which are punished in their own countries, I think should not be reversed. Let me take the example and the look on 2015. In 2014, I was still head of the ZDF office in New York. The World Food Programme and the UNHCR asked in public for immediate more funding to feed Syrian refugees in Turkey, in Lebanon and elsewhere. And the international community did not deliver the money which was needed. Then, in Syria, Aleppo fell, and many Syrians in Turkey knew there is no fast way back into my hometown area. when laws are so changed that a university like the Central European University leaves the country, although in the end she was fulfilling those preconditions from the renovated law. All this means the main character of democracy is to respect the will of the people. This means not governing by polls, as many do, not spreading false information or disinformation, as Trump has done extensively in the 4 years of his ruling the United States, and others do in Europe as well. For example, when you listen to Viktor Orban, when he is giving his morning interview on Friday morning in Kossuth radio. I cannot listen to it, of course, because I don't speak Hungarian language, sorry to say so. I not even can count from 1 to 10 in Hungarian. Also, I visited many often times Hungary from 2005 to 2011. But I, every Monday morning, read the speech transmitted into English and German and spread by the press department of the Prime Minister. And I always, or nearly every second or third week, I find this formulation he finds. Former times, we were ruled by Moscow. Now we do not want to be ruled by Brussels. Meaning, he is looking for his own way, so to say, to establish a proud Hungarian folks, which can be proud of what they do and what they deliver. But don't forget, when you talk about this, you must keep in mind, and I think most of you will have this in your mind, that more than 300,000 Hungarians, and most probably very well-educated people, left the country, beginning not only 2010, but already earlier, and they are somehow missed in the country because, like Katalin Kierko, which I mentioned in the beginning, they went out of the country because the possibilities to follow science, to follow jobs, to fulfill its own life are better elsewhere than they are in your country in the moment. We have other things we could talk about. For example, what did he do to the Academy of Science? What did the government do to them? What did they do with LGBT community? What did they decide in June when they established this new law that children, as the Justice Minister says, Ms. Varga, should be protected against influence against homosexuals and pedophiles? What do we think about the rule of law, how it is practiced in Hungary, and how the mediascape is developing in the last 11 years? I was there in 2010 already when Orban won his first election, and immediately he put sharp control on public radio and public television. He put together public television and public radio together with the news agency, and he tightened his grip on every media in the country more and more in the last 11 years, so that if you look really for opposition which is able to expel itself and to come to the people and tell them what they are willing to do, it's hard for them. I mention only that the mayor of Budapest mentioned the other day that he only once in his time had time in public radio to speak about what his plans are. Last week, a delegation of 7 members of European Parliament visited Hungary in order to look for the rule of law and the implementation of rule of law and other questions. As far as I understand, they were then welcomed with the headlines in some Orban near newspapers, the crazy girls of Europe. 5 of them have been female member of parliament, 2 of them men. So the crazy girls were the 5 who now criticize still what they've heard in this 2-day visit. They told yesterday in a press conference, and maybe you could read it somewhere on the internet, I would expect not too much you could read in the newspapers in Hungary, that they didn't get the answers they wanted to. Of course, they did not have the possibility to speak to Viktor Orban, but they spoke, for example, to the chief of the constitutional judgment. And when they asked him how things are developing in the justice system, he mostly did not really answer the questions they put on the table. This happened different times. They also had talks with Mrs. Varga, the Justice Minister, and Mr. Pinter, the Interior Minister. And also there they made the experience that the questions they put on the table were either rebuffed or were not answered. So the impression still is the European Union should not immediately pay the recovery fund of 7.2 billion euros to Hungary, as long as the question of rule of law is not really answered. This is an ongoing procedure, and we will see how it develops. But as Viktor Orban always is, he found a way around it, and he put on the market 2 loans, which enable him to go into the election campaign and spending the money he wants to spend, for example, to re-establish the 13th pension months for pensioners and other things for rural areas, so that he can be more or less sure that the rural area and the older persons in the country might re-elect him again in April. We'll see. So a lot of questions arise, and the last questions will be answered in the next 14 days, when on October 9th, the second round of primary elections, if you want so, to the contrary candidate for the elections will be elected in Hungary. I'm very interested in who will win this, because when I learned that now the spouse of Georgiany had won the first round, I was afraid this would be an easy task for Viktor Orban to tell. She, member of European Parliament, but also spouse of Georgiany, is the right contrary to me, because I always can say she was married to him and she knows him and she is a socialist and she contributed to the situation I took over in 2010, and I had to do so many things to improve the situation in Hungary. So you cannot really vote for her. And I think it's interesting whether the mayor of Budapest or the spouse of Georgiany will be the front runner after these primary elections. To sum up a little bit, I think if we don't make it in the future that Europe is united, we will lose our importance worldwide. Already now we must recognize we are only contributing to 6% of the GDP worldwide. We are still economically successful, but we have to guarantee that this will be possible in the future as well. One of the possibilities might be what President Biden offered to the European Union, and which started last Tuesday in Pittsburgh, a trade and tariff agreement and a trade and technical accomplishment, which started, and now 10 working groups with people from the European Union as well as from the United States will sort out what can we do together, what can we fix, and what could make things easier for trade and development between our both Europe and the United States. It's more or less, I think, try to re-establish a little bit the thing which was ended and stranded in the final days of the Obama government administration, the TTIP, which was the same aim. Together, we could say to the world, these are the obligations you have to fulfill if you, for example, export a car into the European Union and into the United States. That's the preliminary things you need to fulfill if you want to make trade with us. This, for example, would also mean, for example, that we think about how we regulate internet platforms in the future, as well in Europe, as well as in the United States. Parliaments are now thinking about it, and the European Parliament and the European governments in Brussels will together try to figure out until the end of the year of a Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act will be finalized, aiming at regulating those internet platforms who are working in both areas, and not only there, but also in Asia, in Latin America, and in Australia. So if we get our acts together, we can really say we can do something together to stop the increasing influence of China in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. and contradict what they are aiming at with their influence, with, for example, 16 nations meanwhile in Europe, and offering them more or less trying to bribe them, for example. But look at Montenegro, what happens there. China built Autobahn, and immediately half of the budget of Montenegro is in debt to China. That cannot be the way to cooperate with the Chinese, especially then when we always see that the Chinese bring in their own construction companies, their own workers, and so the money stays with them and it doesn't really influence in a positive way the European outcome. Altogether, I'm not sure whether we can succeed in this way. I can also imagine we fail and then we come back to the situation we had in the 50s and 60s. At this time, we had European economic cooperation between several countries like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and others. And we had the European Union of 6 and 15. Maybe we can succeed and we stay at the level of 27 or maybe 33 when the 6 Western Balkan nations come into the European Union. But this is not for sure. It depends on every nation which is now incorporated in the European Union, and it depends on every citizen in the European Union, whether we have a future which is affordable for all of us, which is under the aspect of green economy, a future-oriented society, and which is a society which also is willing and doing its part to help developing nations to come up to the levels we already had in the 19th century, for example. This, I would say, is the beginning, and now I'm open for Q&A for all of you, because I think some things would be seen from the one or the other a little bit different than I put it. Thank you for listening.